By the time the rescue boat floated past my mailbox, the HOA president was still insisting this was my fault. "It's because he built unauthorized structures in the creek," shrieked Tamara Ellison, standing ankle-deep in muddy water in what used to be the cul-de-sac of Cypress Hollow Estates. She was soaked, mascara-streaked, still clutching her leather HOA binder like it was a life raft. Behind her, the fire chief pointed at the empty gap where my first emergency dam used to be. "That structure is exactly what would have stopped this," he said. Or did, until somebody tore it out. A firefighter in a raft paddled past a half-submerged Tesla, staring at Tamara. "Ma'am, is that you on this video?" he asked, holding up his phone. It showed her the day before, in dry clothes, proudly posing as a landscaper crew cut away the sandbags and plywood bracing for my dam. "Of course it's me," she snapped. "It was a violation. I'm the HOA president. I enforce the rules." The county flood engineer, who looked like he hadn't slept since 2019, squinted at her. "You knowingly removed a functioning flood control barrier during a declared storm emergency? Without permit? On someone else's property?" She opened her mouth, then closed it. I stood on my porch, dry behind the still intact second dam upstream, sipping coffee in rubber boots. The deputy turned to me. "Mr. Logan Price," he said, "I'm gonna have some follow-up questions for you, and a lot more for her." Tamara finally seemed to understand the situation. "Wait," she said faintly, watching brown water swirl around the HOA's new stone entry sign. Is this a crime?" The engineer just shook his head. "Lady," he said, "you didn't just break an HOA rule. You messed with hydrology. My name's Logan Price. 38. Structural engineer. Favorite hobbies include quiet weekends, bad sci-fi movies, and minding my own business. I bought my place in Cypress Hollow Estates because the listing mentioned a creek view and natural greenbelt. It failed to mention the creek was technically a regulated drainage channel. Our subdivision was built in what used to be a seasonal floodplain, and the developer promised state-of-the-art detention ponds and then delivered 2 decorative puddles with rocks around them. My house backed up to Willow Run Creek, which was normally a polite trickle with ducks. But after a few years of hotter summers and freak storms, it had started doing impressions of a fire hose. 3 times in 2 years, the creek nearly overtopped its banks. Twice it did spill, turning backyards into kiddie pools and sending water right up to patio doors. Each time, residents begged the HOA to clear debris from the culverts, fix the undersized drain under the main road, and maybe, just maybe, invest in actual flood mitigation. Each time, Tamara Ellison sent out a newsletter reminding us that trash cans must be stored out of sight, garden gnomes were prohibited, and any alterations to common water features were strictly forbidden. Tamara was the kind of woman who laminated things for fun. Former realtor. Current tyrant. Professionally blonde. She wore a whistle on a lanyard like she was coaching a team we never agreed to join. I tried to stay off her radar. I planted native grasses, kept my lawn neat. My truck fit in the garage. I paid my dues on autopilot and ignored the quarterly president's message where she compared enforcing mailbox paint shades to defending democracy. Then, one spring, the forecast started saying phrases like once-in-100-year storm series. And the creek, which already hated us, was about to make a point. When the first big storm hit, I was ready. I'd spent the winter reading county floodplain maps, attending boring meetings, and talking to the actual drainage engineer. When I showed him photos of our overflowing creek, he whistled. "Yeah, they undersized that culvert," he said. "You're basically a clogged artery waiting for a heart attack." I asked what I could legally do on my property. "You can't pour concrete or install permanent structures without permits," he said. "But you can absolutely build temporary, emergency barriers on your land. Think sandbag walls, bracing, splashboards. Especially in a declared emergency." So I did. In 30 days, with a couple weekends of help from my neighbor Ravi, we built Dam A, a reinforced sandbag and timber barrier at the lower edge of my property, just before the creek dove under the street, and Dam B, a slightly higher, secondary barrier 20 yards upstream, shaped to gently redirect overflow into the greenbelt instead of backyards. They weren't pretty. They looked like something between a military fort and a beaver's fever dream. But they worked. The next storm rolled in. The creek rose, snarled at my sandbags, and stopped. Water pooled calmly behind Dam A, then spilled in a controlled sheet into the designated overflow swale that developers had half-heartedly carved and Tamara had later fenced off as a butterfly garden. No yards flooded. No patios swam. The county guy even drove by during the rain, rolled down his window, and gave me a thumbs up. Tamara, however, lost her mind. 2 days later, I got my first email. Subject: Unapproved earthworks/dam structures. Dear homeowner, the board has received complaints regarding unsightly sandbag piles and unauthorized alteration of common water features behind Lot 27. These dams violate sections 5.3, Aesthetics, and 8.1, Water Feature Modifications, of the covenants. She called them water features like they came with mermaids. I replied, politely attaching the county's emergency guidance, the email from the drainage engineer saying, "Good idea for now," and before and after photos of last year's near flooding versus this year's controlled flow. She answered in 12 minutes, which should have been my first warning. The HOA is not subordinate to suggestions from a county employee. Dams A and B must be removed within 10 days. I ignored her. She escalated. $100 initial violation fine. $250 landscape non-compliance fine. $500 willful defiance fine, which wasn't even a real category in the documents. I checked. Then came the in-person theatrics. She showed up in my yard during a mild drizzle, standing 3 inches from the sandbags in pristine white sneakers. "These are an eyesore," she declared. "They're preventing everyone's living rooms from becoming indoor pools," I replied. "We already have retention ponds," she sniffed. I gestured at the useless decorative basins near the playground. "Those are bird baths with a marketing budget." Her eyes narrowed. "If you don't take these down, the HOA will arrange removal. At your expense. You touch them and there's a flood," I said. "That's on you." She smiled, the way villains do right before they ignore physics. "You don't understand," she said sweetly. "Rules are rules." The day before the big flood, the sky was that sickly green-gray that says, "Oh, you thought last week was bad, hold my beer." The county had already issued an emergency alert for heavy rain, saturated ground, high flood risk. They specifically warned anyone near creeks to reinforce existing sandbag barriers and avoid tampering with drainage. I was at work on a site visit when my phone pinged. First, my doorbell cam showed Tamara, in rain gear and lipstick, marching into my backyard with 3 guys in neon vests. One carried bolt cutters. Another had a shovel. Then, a group text from my neighbor Ravi. "Bro. HOA's messing with your dam. You want me to call the cops?" I called Tamara. "Hey," I said, a little out of breath. "Step away from my sandbags. We're conducting an HOA-approved restoration," she said primly. I could hear shovels scraping in the background. "You failed to comply." I hired a landscaper to return the creek to its natural appearance. "The county said not to touch flood barriers," I snapped. "We're under an emergency alert." "The county doesn't own this subdivision," she replied. "The HOA does." "That's not how anything works." By the time I drove back, white-knuckling it through sheets of rain, Dam A was gone. They'd cut the bracing, rolled the sandbags aside to reveal the natural flow, and proudly raked the bank smooth like a beach. Dam B was still intact upstream, diverting some water, but now there was nothing slowing the main surge as it barreled toward the culvert under the street. And that culvert? Completely clogged with branches and debris the HOA had never cleared because the landscaper's contract doesn't cover that area. Ravi met me at the fence, wide-eyed. "They left, like, 20 minutes ago," he shouted over the growing roar. "You weren't kidding about the water." The creek had tripled in size, churning brown and furious. It hit the spot where Dam A had been, hesitated for a fraction of a second, as if insulted, and then leapt the bank. Water slammed into the undermined side of the culvert, which shrugged, gurgled, and then basically gave up on existing. I watched in numb horror as the road dipped, a crack spiderwebbed across the asphalt, and a chocolate tsunami launched itself down the street directly toward the lower cul-de-sac. Cars. Lawns. The HOA's proudly landscaped stone monument. All in the path. By nightfall, half the lower loop was under 3 feet of water. Soggy Christmas decorations floated past even though it was April. A trampoline surfed majestically down the block. As emergency vehicles rolled in, Tamara appeared in a raincoat, shouting to anyone who would listen that the flood was caused by illegal dams. I had built them wrong, and the HOA was just trying to maintain natural drainage. Unfortunately for her, my doorbell cam and Ravi's phone had captured her gleeful demolition, complete with this immortal line. Once we tear this ugly thing out, the water can go back to normal. Normal, as it turned out, meant in your living room. The next morning, the neighborhood looked like a disaster movie had a hangover. The lower cul-de-sac was a mud crater. 2 cars sat at awkward angles where the asphalt had collapsed. The HOA's stone entry sign lay face down like it had fainted, half buried in silt. News vans parked along the one dry side street. Drones buzzed overhead. Someone had already created a Facebook group called Cypress Hollow Flood Survivors. The county emergency manager set up a folding table on the driest part of the sidewalk. Residents lined up to give statements. Insurance adjusters prowled like vultures in polo shirts. Tamara tried to hold court under a golf umbrella, binder in one hand, explaining to anyone with a microphone that this happened because one homeowner built unapproved dams, redirecting the water. We had to take action. It's tragic, but the board was just enforcing the rules. Ma'am, interrupted Deputy Morales, who had clearly had enough, we've now seen 3 separate videos of you personally ordering the removal of a functional sandbag barrier while an emergency alert was active. Her smile flickered. Those videos lack context. He nodded slowly. Sure. That's why the county attorney's going to ask you about context. Under oath. The county flood engineer spread out diagrams on the table, gesturing with a pencil. Look here, he told a cluster of soaked residents. With both temporary dams, the creek would have risen this high, and he put his hand waist level and overflowed into the designed swale. He moved his hand to shoulder height. Once Dam A was removed, the water shot straight down to the undersized culvert, overflowed, undermined the road, and flooded the cul-de-sac. Whoever removed that dam dramatically worsened the damage. Everyone slowly turned to look at Tamara, who was suddenly very interested in a spot of mud near her shoe. I stayed mostly quiet, handing over my emails, screenshots, and the county engineer's earlier good idea message. The deputy clicked his pen. So, Mr. Price, he said, just so we're clear. You built temporary emergency barriers on your land with county guidance. You informed the HOA president. She ignored that, hired people to remove one, and now we've got $500,000 in damage downstream. I nodded. And you have all the correspondence? I slid a neatly organized binder across the table. Tab 3 is her threatening to restore the aesthetics before the big storm. Tab 4 is the doorbell footage. Behind us, residents started to mutter. She did this? I begged her to do something about the flooding last year. She fined me for painting my shutters too dark, but she can just wreck a dam? By the end of the day, the county had taped off the HOA office as under investigation. The board scheduled an emergency meeting that no one believed would save Tamara. The phrase unauthorized hydrological intervention became the weirdest new joke in the neighborhood group chat. For the first time since I'd moved in, Tamara wasn't the one walking around like she owned the block. She was the one being quietly photographed from behind lawn hedges as people whispered the word lawsuit. 3 months later, in a windowless county hearing room that smelled like stale coffee and paper, Tamara finally met consequences that didn't come on HOA letterhead. The proceedings combined a county violation hearing, an insurance arbitration, and what looked emotionally like a public execution. The county attorney ran through the evidence with the casual brutality of someone who really liked their job. Emergency declaration notice time-stamped 2 hours before dam removal. My emails warning the HOA of flood risk and sharing county guidance. The landscaper's invoice for dam tear-out per HOA president's directions. The video of Tamara, smiling at the camera, saying, once this ugly barricade is gone, we can stop scaring people about floods. Then they played the next video showing water roaring through the spot where the dam used to be, the culvert giving up, cars floating. Tamara's lawyer tried. My client was simply attempting to enforce community bylaws, he argued. She believed these structures were unsafe and unauthorized. The county engineer raised an eyebrow. She's not an engineer. She's not a contractor. She's not authorized to alter drainage infrastructure. And we explicitly told her, on this recorded call, and he played audio, to leave all sandbag structures in place until after the storms. The audio of her saying, "Well, we'll see about that, this is private property," did not help her case. The final report used phrases like gross negligence, reckless disregard for known hazard, and unauthorized modification of flood control features. Insurance companies, smelling an opportunity, pounced. "We will not be covering damages caused by willful interference with emergency mitigation," the HOA's insurer said coldly. "That falls under excluded intentional acts." Translation: the HOA was on the hook. And by the HOA, they largely meant Tamara, who had personally greenlit the whole thing. The board wasted exactly 12 hours before voting to remove her as president, ban her from holding any future office in Cypress Hollow, and strongly encourage her to hire her own attorney. Then came the lawsuits. Homeowners from the flood zone sued the HOA. The HOA cross-claimed against Tamara. Someone started selling "Don't Mess with Dams" t-shirts to fund a legal defense committee. In the end, the settlement looked like this. The HOA's remaining reserves went to repairs. A special assessment hit every homeowner except me and the other upstream lots who proved we'd tried to prevent it. Tamara's personal liability insurance maxed out and still wasn't enough. The county levied a civil penalty of $75,000 for the unauthorized removal of emergency flood infrastructure during a declared emergency. As part of the county's resolution, they required a new, properly engineered reinforcement along the creek. Guess where the main permanent concrete diversion wall had to go to be most effective? Directly behind Tamara's backyard. The day they poured the last section, I took a walk down the greenbelt. Her once pristine view of the natural creek was now partly blocked by a handsome, city-approved flood wall with a bright metal sign. Caution, flood control structure, do not tamper. She was on her patio, staring at it like it had insulted her haircut. I gave her a polite nod. "Looks good," I said. "Really fits the aesthetics." Cypress Hollow changed after the flood. A lot of people were broke and furious enough to actually read the HOA bylaws they'd been ignoring for years. Within 6 months, the old board was out. The fining system was gutted. A new rule was added stating the HOA could not override any safety, structural, or emergency guidance from city, county, or state agencies. We also started a creek committee, mostly an excuse for neighbors to keep the culverts clear, host barbecues by the now properly maintained swales, and tell newcomers the legendary story of the president who tried to argue with gravity. My emergency dams? The county turned my original design into an official plan. They built a reinforced version of Dam A at the lower bank with actual engineers, not just me and Ravi and Home Depot sandbags. They offered me a small stipend for my documentation and modeling work. They even gave the structure an official name, Price Diversion Barrier. It got a little metal plaque and everything. As for Tamara, the punishment was thorough. Legally, she ended up with a hefty civil judgment that would haunt her wages for years, a formal reprimand from the state's HOA oversight panel, and a 5-year ban from serving on any HOA board in the state. Practically, she got sideways looks at the grocery store, a permanently muddy patch in her front yard where floodwater had killed her precious ornamental grasses, and a new neighbor nickname, Dam Buster. She did not appreciate this. Eventually, she put her house on the market. The listing photos carefully cropped out the flood control wall, the "Do Not Tamper" sign, and the barely visible stain line on the brickwork. On her last day, as movers shut the truck doors, she glanced once more at the creek. Then up at my place, where I was on the deck checking the weather app. Our eyes met. She seemed like she wanted to say something, apology, threat, who knows, but instead she just got in the car and left. The new buyers brought over cookies and, cautiously, asked, "So, we heard there was some kind of flood drama?" "Yeah," I said. Short version. One person thought HOA bylaws beat physics. Physics disagreed. If there's a moral, it's this. You can bully people about mailbox colors. You can micromanage grass height. You can even convince yourself an entire neighborhood answers to your binder. But water doesn't care about your rules. And if you tear down an emergency dam because it's not in the architectural palette, don't be surprised when the only thing that gets washed away is your control.